Hi and welcome to this session where I'm going to be going through the IT management approaches, methodologies, activities and practices, and I'll be giving you the main headline points and the base foundation knowledge you need to know. I'll also be discussing some of my real-world application of these activities and practices in the various organisations I've worked in. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like and click the bell for those updates. Okay, so let's get down to it. Today I'm going to be covering off the key concepts within Siam, service integration and management, and I'm going to be covering this in this one video which will cover all the various elements and the key concepts you need to know. So I'm going to be covering things like the Siam layers, the Siam structures, the drivers, why would an organization, why would a customer consider going for a Siam model. We're going to talk around some terminology as well. We'll be covering things like practices, functions, roles, structural elements, models, and we'll talk around the roadmap as well. Okay, so let's kick off with layers then. So Siam layers, there are three layers here you need to be aware of. There's a customer layer, there's a service integrator layer, sometimes called SI, and the service provider layer, sometimes called SP. Now, as you think these three layers through, you can split up things like strategy, integration and delivery into each one of them. So the customer organization, that's the strategy layer. The service integrator layer, that's the integration layer, as you might imagine. And the service provider layer, that's the delivery. The important thing around the service provider layer, just to note, is that you can have internal service providers. So perhaps there are service providers from the customer, for example, and then external service providers as well. Within the customer layer, so this strategy layer, there's something called retain capabilities. So these are the functions that a customer would want to hang on to, and they're usually things like governance type activities, oversight, business engagement, enterprise architecture or anything architectural based, strategic activity, procurement activity sometimes, although I have seen this within the SI and the SP as well. Enterprise risk, it's not unusual for that to be within the retained capabilities, and contract management, of course. So let's talk about the customer organization. So the role of the customer organization is basically they are the ones that are commissioning the service, and they are they're providing the direction, the control, the strategy element, particularly in terms of what the model is. So the customer you will have at the top of your ecosystem, and maybe previously they will have had a relationship with a whole load of service providers. Now, depending on what the drivers are, it may be that is becoming too much and they want a service integrator there in the middle to help them out with that, and we'll talk about that as we go on. But typically the traditional model, the multi-service provider model, is you've got your customer at the top and then you've got lots of service providers that all feed into this customer. In the model of Siam, you have a relationship with a service integrator. So the customer has that relationship with the service integrator, and then the service integrator manages that end-to-end service with all the service providers, and they can be internal, they can be external. The customer still retains the commercial relationship with each service provider, but it's really important that the customer is seen to be enforcing the message that the service integrator is in control here. So they have the power, if you like, and the customer should avoid trying to bypass the service integrator and talking to the service providers directly, and the vice versa. The service providers need to make sure that they're not speaking straight to the customer. They need to be speaking into that service integrator and not trying to bypass the models. We've talked about retained capabilities as well. So a customer organization, there will be retained capabilities that the customer is going to say, I'm going to hang on to this and that may be risk or contract management or governance type activities. So that's the customer organization. The service integrator layer, that's the next layer. So service integrator, they're responsible for managing those service providers. Again, service providers can be internal and they can be external. They are part of the governance, the integration element, making sure that the ecosystem as a whole is working well, that there's a collaborative approach working, that all the service providers look at it as an end-to-end service, and fundamentally providing and engaging with those service providers to make sure they are delivering and providing value to the customer. Collaboration is very much a key word there that needs to be put into place. And then service providers. So the service provider within the ecosystem, typically there's going to be a number of service providers, and they will be providing various services, various elements. Perhaps that's hosting services or compute services or application or support, whatever it is. Each service provider will be responsible for providing its part in the contracted service overall. So technology based, support based, but it's very much of an end-to-end delivery model. I've mentioned a couple of times that you can have external service providers and internal service providers. External service providers are pretty self-explanatory. It's another service provider that isn't part of the customer organization, and they are providing services, or they will have previously been provide services to the customer. There'll be a contract in place. There will be service level agreements. Perhaps there are monthly service reviews. An internal service provider is usually a team or a department of some kind that is part of the customer organization. So for example, it might be application support, or may even be a service desk, or it could be a development team of some kind. And there will be agreements in place and KPIs and targets that will have more than likely been agreed up front internally to provide that service to the customer. Typically, you would want to categorize service providers as well, and how you work those categories out is up to yourself, but you would want to think through some kind of strategic, tactical, commodity, operational type approach, and then work through the structure as to what's the nature of the relationships here, and clearly adding a risk management to this point. So it may not necessarily be, if you look at value, for example, you may say, okay, well, this provider is only providing, it's only costing $100,000 a year or $10,000 a year or whatever it may be. So you may think, okay, well, they need less attention than another organization that's perhaps providing a service and it's costing $1 million a year. A note of warning there, you really need to look through as to what are they providing. So that provider that is only providing $10,000 a year or $100,000 a year, okay, you don't want to be thinking, well, let's not give them as much attention as another provider if the service that they're providing is absolutely critical. So don't fall into the trap of just it being financially led, I suppose. Think strategically, think tactically, think commodity, think operationally. Don't just look at values. Okay, so now let's look at structures then. So we have a structure that can be externally sourced. So you can have an externally sourced integrator. And just to point out here, when I talk about structures, I've done other videos around governance structures, organizational structures, contract structures, management structures, license structures. This is separate to this activity. When I talk about structures here in this context, it's Siam structures. So there are 4 types of structures. There's an externally sourced service integrator. There's an internally sourced service integrator. There's a hybrid service integrator, which you won't be surprised to know is actually a combination of number 1 and number 2, the external and the internal. And then you have a lead supplier as a service integrator, where one of the service providers is also a service integrator. So let's dig a little deeper into the externally sourced integrator. So first off, when a customer is deciding on what kind of structure should we be looking at, there will be lots of considerations. There'll be business requirements. There'll be questions around value. There's some element of we want better governance or better assurance, or it's really complex, so we need to simplify it, or maybe integration's not so great. So there will be elements like business requirements, the capabilities. So read into that things like maturity of the organization, maturity of teams, maturity of the departments, the processes, procedures, practices, skills, and resource availability. It's not unusual for there to be an element of legislative or regulatory requirements in there, or perhaps there's a timescale element that will play a part in this as well, as to which structure is going to suit here. So timescales does play a part in that element. There's also an appetite question around certain customers may feel a little wobbly about losing direct control, or there are models where that can be sort of weaned off a bit in terms of, okay, well, let's get you involved in this, we can sort of make a situation where we can show you how a Siam model would work and give you confidence to be able to hand complete control over. And there's a risk appetite element in there as well. But certainly appetite for risk and appetite in terms of the view of losing control is part of that equation. So structures in terms of external. So an external service integrator is solely responsible for managing service providers, and it doesn't have any service provider responsibilities. Now, it's an important distinction there. In the external model, the service integrator, their role is managing service providers. You would see it in terms of pictorially, you would have your customer at the top and their retained capabilities. The next layer down, the second layer, would be external service integrator. So this is what we're talking about. And then underneath that, you would have your service providers. You would have lots of external service providers and perhaps internal service providers in there as well. And the customer retaining those capabilities around governance, oversight, engagement, architectural practices, maybe enterprise architecture, risk, and those kind of capabilities. Externally sourced works well where an organization, they're prepared for another organization to take on this SI role, this service integrator role. So perhaps there's a level of, okay, well, we want to do Siam, but we don't want to increase our headcount. Or perhaps they just don't have service integration capabilities. Neither do they want to go out and recruit them, so that's the headcount point, but neither do they want to maintain them or develop them ongoing. So they don't want to manage them. So it works well in that situation. There is a level of trust here, of course, because you are allowing another organisation to manage all those service providers. Quickly, in terms of pros and cons of each, so the pros would be around, you can get those benefits much quicker. You can get benefit realization much quicker. There is a potential for improved value in there as the service integrator uses their experience in the ecosystem and brings about efficiencies and better ways of working and more efficacy generally. There's also a separation of concerns in there. So the service integrator is solely focusing on the governance, the oversight, the coordination, the collaboration of all those service providers, thinking through processes, metrics, reporting, service. So there's a definite separation of concerns. The service integrator, they have one job, and it's not being a service provider, it's being a service integrator. The disadvantages of this structure is that there is a high level of dependency. So from a customer perspective, you are relying on that service integrator. If you get it wrong, there's a risk of higher costs. So it's really important that those are monitored and kept in check. There is a potential that you may have internal service providers kind of thinking, well, hang on a minute, I work for the customer, but now I've got this other organization, this other entity, the service integrator, that seems to be telling me what to do. So they're almost being managed by this external organization. Needs to be managed, needs to be worked through. It's perfectly feasible for this to work in this model, but just to be aware of that up front. And then also a service integrator needs to build relationships with the customer organization and also with the service providers. So this is almost the third person coming in. There's a customer with a relationship with the service provider, and the service provider a relationship with the customer, and then suddenly a service integrator's coming in. So there is that relationship element that needs to be built. The other disadvantage, just as a summary kind of advantages and disadvantages, I'm mindful that the contractual relationship position can sometimes cause some issues in terms of the service integrator doesn't technically have a contract with the service providers. That's still with the customer. So it's really important that the customer allows the service integrator to act on its behalf. Otherwise, it doesn't have any teeth. The model doesn't stand, because the service providers will start speaking to the customer and the customer will start speaking to the service provider. It's really important that the customer reinforces that message, one of authority, with the service integrator. Just as a parting thought around structures and an external model around reporting and measuring, you need to be quite precise about how are you going to measure value in this approach. So there is quantitative metrics, there's qualitative metrics as well, and I have done a balanced scorecard video about this as well on my channel. So do have a look at that in terms of how do you show back to a customer the service integrator value point, and that covers your various dimensions: financial, service provider, innovation, transformation, customer service management, collaborative activities. But think through how do you measure success in terms of an external model? Well, less noise, less escalations, better collaboration, better governance, integration, demonstrating end-to-end value reporting would certainly spring to mind, as well as efficacy of structural elements. So what do I mean by structural elements? Working groups, governance boards, perhaps CAB, maybe attendance of service providers into various boards and working groups, and then also things like onboarding new service providers or retiring service providers. Some kind of metrics there that can lead to demonstrating value, but clearly focusing on business outcomes. Okay, so the internal structure. When we talk about an internal sourced service integrator, so a reminder, we've got the external approach, we've got the internal approach, we've got a hybrid approach, and we've got a lead supplier. So we've discussed the external. The internal approach, same kind of thinking. So the decision making process is going to be thinking through business requirements, capabilities, complexity, the organization type and size. Maybe there's some regulatory requirements, perhaps there's a Sarbanes-Oxley consideration there, or budget, whatever it may be. There's going to be appetite questions and risk appetite questions. From a customer perspective, they will come to a conclusion in terms of, okay, well, maybe we're going to go for an internal model. So in this model, the customer organization actually takes the role of the SI, the service integrator, assuming it's got service integration capabilities here as well. So that's a really important point, is maybe they don't, but they need to get hold of them and they need to manage and mature and develop them. But as a model, thinking through the structure, you've got your customer organization with your retained capabilities, things like governance, oversight, engagement, enterprise architecture, anything strategic or risk or contract management wise, rather than another layer which shows the service integrator. That service integrator is held within the customer organization. So rather than a 3-tier model, think of it as a 2-tier model. You have the customer organization, retained capabilities, and a separate element within the customer organization, whether that's reporting into IT or not, but a separate element that is a service integrator. And then out of that, you've got your service providers, external and internal service providers. Usually this is adopted where a customer already has those skills and those capabilities, or there's appetite to go out and recruit and acquire those capabilities. It does work well where a customer doesn't want to lose control. So in the external model, there's an element of, okay, we're going to trust this external service integrator. This model here, in terms of internal, the customer organization still retains control and has more flexibility over the ecosystem as a whole. I've worked in a number of Sarbanes-Oxley environments or environments where there's regulatory control or legislative elements to it. And I've certainly seen this model as quite a common occurrence in terms of approach, mainly because the customer then still has that ownership of the SI layer. Another term just to be aware of when it comes to internal structures is augmentation, resource augmentation. And basically this is where individual roles within the SI are filled using directly employed internal staff, but supplemented by resources by an external organisation. So that the customer still has that overall ownership and control is the gist there. As a recap, internally sourced structures works well where there's an in-house service integration team already, or there's capabilities there, or the customer has decided we're going to invest in this. We are going to go out and recruit resources and we're going to acquire those skills. Typically, I've seen this as a common occurrence within the regulatory type environments, or where there's heavy governance or an oversight required around the management of those service providers. It suits customers where they don't want to give up control or they don't want to lose any kind of flexibility. So in the external model, you're trusting, you're losing some of that control, if you like, over to an external service integrator, whereas in this model, the internal model, the customer still retains that control and that flexibility. It works well as well where timescales perhaps are tight. So if there's a short period of time where this needs to be spun up, and it needs to be done quickly, this can actually work quite well in that particular environment. Pros and cons of each for the internal model. Well, clearly the customer's got full control. They're still managing it. They still have that service integration element. Those skills, that knowledge, that know-how, that capability, it retains in-house. It's not going outside to an external integrator. Provides greater flexibility. It also potentially means there's less contractual activity because it's already the service integrator is already the customer. So there's not lengthy contractual conversations or amendments or any kind of activities around there. Also, I've certainly seen external service providers don't see the new service integrator, which is the customer, as any kind of competitor, whereas in an external model you could argue that there is that potential conflict there where another service provider may see a service integrator as some kind of competitor and less likely to collaborate with them. In the internal model, you've got a greater likelihood of collaboration because the customer is already somebody that the service provider's dealing with. Disadvantages here, well, clearly if the customer's already said it's going to go out and get those resources and manage them, fine, but there is an overhead with that. Clearly they have to develop those skills, they've got to maintain them, they've got to manage them, the capability levels, the resourcing levels, the skill levels. There's an overhead there. Underestimation, I would say, is a big one here in terms of the disadvantages. A customer organisation may well underestimate how this is going to work in terms of resourcing, levels of knowledge needed, and they may over-egg their capabilities in terms of, yes, we can do this. So I've certainly seen that in my experience, that the model's been chosen as internal, but the customer has perhaps overestimated their ability and underestimated the amount of resourcing, the amount of expertise needed here. Because the service integrator is the customer as well, effectively within that same model, it can be harder if you're having conversations with internal service providers. So those are teams that are already within the customer's organisation. There's that sometimes can just be a bit challenging because they are one of the same, and perhaps external service providers may look at that as you're being more favourable, more biased towards the internal teams than you are the external teams. Parting thought on that: where do you put a service integrator that is internal? Because it's part of the customer organisation. It's the customer anyway. So some internal service integrators are structured within the IT department or the data team. Others are in completely separate departments. There are pros and cons of each, and it's really each organisation needs to work out where is that structure going to be, because it does need a level of independence there. Okay, let's move on to hybrid. So I would say in a nutshell, a hybrid is a combination of the two models we've already discussed, the internal and the external model. So in a well, I suppose just by way of a reminder, there are 4 models you can choose from. You can go external, internal, hybrid, which we'll talk about now, or lead supplier. Now, in the hybrid model, what you effectively have is the customer collaborates with an external organisation to be a service integrator. So there's almost this hand-holding activity here between the customer external and the customer service integrator. So this works well where perhaps the customer itself is not 100% sure here, and it wants to retain an element of control. Perhaps as a regulatory element, as an example. So they still want to demonstrate there's an element of control with the service integrator. So they haven't gone full on external and give everything to the external. They haven't gone full on internal where there's no external party and it's all managed internally. They've kind of gone a halfway house here. Maybe they don't have the skills to perform all of the activities. So maybe they've got skills to do some of them, but not all of them. So it's kind of a halfway house, if you like. So you would typically see this, that there's internal resources here and there's external resources, and the appetite here is one of the customer does want to do Siam, but they want to develop it. They want to almost have a taste and see element of this, if you like. They want to draw on the expertise of an external service integrator, but at the same time still having that knowledge in-house and acquiring that knowledge in-house. You'd usually see this as a temporary arrangement until the customer feels more confident, until they've understood it, until they've perhaps acquired sufficient levels of knowledge and skill set to be a service integrator standalone. So it's usually kind of it's a migration step in one sense. So as a recap, you've got your customer organisation with the retained capabilities. Then the next layer would be hybrid, and that's basically a combination of the external model and the customer being a service integrator. And then you've got the external service providers and the internal service providers. Typically, you would see this where an organization is that they maybe they don't have totally all the right skills or all the right knowledge, but they have a good level of it, and they don't want to completely jump into the pool. They just want to get a good level of understanding and acquire those skills over a period of time. It is a holding position. It's a temporary structure. Usually it can be permanent, and I've certainly seen it in other organisations where it was put in place as a temporary arrangement, and now years down the line it's still working, and this is the permanent solution. Usually, however, what happens is it's spun up as a model. It's seen as a temporary arrangement, and then once the customer has the confidence, once they've retained and absorbed the skills from the external party, the service integration skills are then developed and maintained in-house, and then it's transitioned into an internal structure. Or it may be that it goes out to they don't want this hybrid structure anymore, and it's transitioned into an external integrator, or perhaps, and we'll cover it in a minute, the lead supplier structure as well. So it's kind of a halfway house, if you like. It's an approach that a customer can say, look, I've got some skills and I have the commitment to develop this and I want to maintain it and acquire these skills, but I don't have them. Can an external party come in and just hold my hand for a period of time until I've acquired all of those skills? Briefly, the advantages and disadvantages here. Clearly, the advantages are the customer can develop the skills and the resources at a rate that's relevant for them, so they can build those over a period of time. The benefits can be realised pretty quickly in this because you've effectively got an expert on hand. You've got a service integrator bringing in the knowledge, the how-to, the expertise, the skills of how to actually do this, whereas the customer may not necessarily have those, and it may, if the customer was to do it on its own, it would take a long time to transition into that Siam model. Whereas in this model, you've got an external trusted party to help and provides those commercial skills and those knowledge approaches that will help a customer. It also, if you think about it, you've almost got this external consultancy type resource that can help with any negotiation with service providers and help any kind of gotchas, if you like, any common mistakes. Disadvantage, well, the customer needs to develop service integration capability. Not only that, they may need to go out and recruit resources, and they may need to grow those resources. They're going to manage and maintain those resources. It's not unusual for there to be an element of duplication of skills here, maybe a bit of confusion about who's doing what. I will reference a RACI matrix here as an excellent way of addressing this particular point. So you're absolutely clear who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed. But this model does open up an area of duplication risk, perhaps some confusion around responsibilities, and at which point is person A or function A or role A, where's that boundary? Where does it then pass over to that other role or service provider or wherever it may be? So there is an element there around there needs to be a clear framework, clear governance as to who is doing what. It is meant to be temporary solution. And as I say, I have seen this in a organisation as a long-term solution, but perhaps this is one of those situations where you do really want this to be a temporary solution, and maybe that temporary solution is a year or 2 years or 18 months or 6 months, whatever it is, but you really want this to be a temporary solution, not necessarily build it as this is a long-term solution and this is how we're going to operate. So if we now just briefly talk about lead supplier. So reminder, we've got externally sourced integrator, internally sourced integrator, hybrid integrator, lead supplier as a service integrator, and all of those models are valid ways of doing a Siam structure. The lead supplier model. So think the service provider, the SP, and the service integrator are one of the same, the SI. So you've got the SP and the SI as one. So in this structure, you've got a service integrator being a service provider. So you've got two externals. You've got an external service integrator and an external service provider. So perhaps this came about where a service provider has bid via maybe there's been an RFI or an RFP, and the service provider bids with the customer and they've won, and suddenly the service provider has become a service integrator, and vice versa. So maybe the service integrator has seen an RFP and that for some service provider services, and they may apply for that, and perhaps they've won it, and now they are not only the service integrator, they're a service provider. Or perhaps an external organisation wins both parts of the tender. So the RFP's gone out and they've won both bits. They not only are the SI, they're the SP as well. So those are those are sort of the three cases where that usually happens. So if we think through the ecosystem here in terms of the customer, the service integrator, and the service provider, let's talk terminology and contractual relationships for a second. So the organisation that's the service provider and the service integrator, so they're both parts, the SP and the SI, the term is lead supplier. Now you may also have come across other terms when we talk about lead supplier, guardians or custodians, but it's just really important to stress the point the service integrator, when it comes to a service provider, doesn't have a contractual relationship. So if we think through the external model or the internal model, that service integrator as an external entity doesn't have a contractual relationship with service providers. Another point just around prime vendor very briefly. So the lead supplier structure is different from a model that you may have heard as prime or vendor prime or prime member. And this is where a service provider, an SP, subcontracts some of the services. So the customer has the contractual relationship with the prime vendor. So if you just sort of expand that out in terms of subcontracts sometimes they're just not going to be relevant from a Siam perspective, because the service provider is the entity that is delivering the service to an agreed level. How they go about that, whether there are subcontracts there or not subcontracts there, isn't necessarily relevant. However, it can be that in some contracts that it will say you're not allowed to subcontract. So of course there's that clear point there, but typically you're not always going to see all of the contracts. You're not going to necessarily see the subcontracts. And then if we just think through how that looks like pictorially, you've got your customer organisation at the top, you've got the retained capabilities within there, then you've got the external service integrator layer, and then underneath that you would have the external service providers and the internal service providers. In this particular scenario, the lead supplier, one of those external service providers actually has a dotted line into the service integrator, because they are one of the same. The external service provider is the service integrator. When would you use that? What typically would be a situation you would use a lead supplier? Well, it's very similar to an externally sourced integrator model. So perhaps the customer doesn't have its own service integration capabilities or resources, and it doesn't want to develop them. So exactly the same as the external model. They want to do service integration and management, but they don't have the staff or the resources or the capabilities. Neither do they want to go about recruiting them, maintaining them, and developing them. So usually in this structure, the customer will create an RFI and an RFP. There'll be a procurement, a tender process to choose a service integrator. And then one of its existing service providers where it already has a relationship with. So perhaps they're already providing, I don't know, let's say hosting for the sake of argument. It's an existing service provider. They are then saying, hey, look, we've already got a relationship with you. We provide hosting services, or I don't know, maybe it's development services or application support or a service desk or whatever it is. The customer already knows this service provider. They know them. They trust them. That may not necessarily be the case, of course. I mean, we're making an assumption that the customer is happy with the service provider and the current services that it's being provided. Clearly, if it doesn't like them or doesn't trust them or doesn't rate the service that's being provided, this isn't going to work. But on the assumption that the customer knows them, they trust them, and the service provider is providing a good level of service, they are effectively bidding to be the service integrator. So there does need to be an element of thinking through here. If you go with this model as a customer, you've got a service integrator and a service provider being one of the same. So how does that work with the other service providers? The other service providers may see, well, hang on, they've got a biased view here, or they're not being totally impartial. They're being more favourable to themselves, if you like, rather than the other service providers. That's a big problem when you're trying to promote a collaborative end-to-end working environment. So the impartiality point and fair advantage, these are things that you need to just be aware of as to how's that going to work. And then from a customer perspective, need to watch out for the situation where you could be charged twice for the same capabilities, perhaps the same resources. Okay, so as a summary, if you were to say, okay, what situations are a customer going to go for a lead supplier? It's where the customer already has that trusted relationship with a service provider. Perhaps they're already providing hosting services. So they know them already. It's a known quantity. They know what they're good at. They know their capabilities. They know they can deliver. So that goes a long way in this model. Clearly, customers that are prepared for another organisation to take on a service integrator role, it's going to be quite suitable for. And in the same way as the external model, if the customer doesn't have those capabilities for service integration and has no appetite to go out and recruit more people, increase the headcount, and doesn't want to develop them somehow or grow those or maintain them, lead supplier works quite well. Very brief pros and cons of each here. We've got as a pro, as an advantage, the setup process can be pretty quick because the service provider's already providing a service to you. It's already working with you. It's already providing a service of some kind. From the customer's perspective, they also may see this as a vested interest. The service provider's already providing a service, so if the service fails, it's going to be subject to penalties at the service provider level. So there's almost that extra incentive, that extra way of making sure that those SLAs are met. Disadvantages, well, there's a level of there's a question there around the governance. You've got a service integrator and a service provider. Do they have good governance in place? How are they maintaining the situation where they can demonstrate they're not providing an unfair advantage for themselves, or they're not being biased to themselves? How are they going to do that? There needs to be ways of demonstrating that they are being fair and they're not being biased, and they are demonstrating that they're trying to work towards a collaborative environment. It could be seen by some of those other service providers that is not the case. And then the charging point as well. So it's really important just to make sure you're not being charged twice. So perhaps there's a role that fits between the service provider and the service integrator. Are you paying the salary for that, if you like, for that resource twice? Because that's not right. Okay, drivers quickly. So why would a company go for a Siam model? So what do we mean when we say driver? Think along the lines of creating and fueling activity. Think triggers. Think why does your organisation want to move to a Siam? What's the will? What's the motivation? Why are you wanting to do this? What's happened? It's really, really, really important. I can't overstress the importance here. You must get to the core reasoning. Why is an organisation looking to move to this model? What's happened? Perhaps there's been a regulatory change and there's just a requirement. Whatever it is, there will be some core driver, and you need to get hold of that driver. When you're building the business case to transition, when you're trying to keep the momentum going, when you're trying to keep people focused, when you're trying to go through the roadmap. I've got another video about roadmaps, but when you're talking through the purpose of all of this, it's really important you get to that. What is the root? What is the core? What is the business driver? Business drivers can be wide and far. They can include things like the value point, maybe governance or assurance, quality, contractual, complexity, integration, management or business cultural fit kind of come into it as well. Performance, maybe it's not the right type of service provider, maybe it's not the right mix, it's just not working. The maturity of the customer as well. Now when I say maturity, I talk about organizational maturity, team maturity, skill set, resource, maturities in terms of practices and processes. So current capabilities and maturity of service integration and service management as well. So what's the adoption levels there? When we talk about drivers in the Siam sense, there are 5 groups. Those 5 groups are service satisfaction, service and sourcing landscapes, operational efficiencies, external drivers, and also commercial drivers. Now, I've created another video that goes into a bit more detail about these 5 groups, and I would urge you to watch it. But very, very quickly, service satisfaction drivers are things like service performance, service provider interaction, clarity of roles and responsibility, the pace of change, the demonstration of value, maybe collaboration's not happening with the service provider, and delivery silos. Service and sourcing landscape. So drivers would include external sourcing, shadow sourcing, stealth IT that's sometimes called, multi-sourcing, increasing the number of service providers, inflexible contracts. Maybe they're not so flexible. And then operational efficiency, so those drivers are around improvement and efficiency related. Maybe just service management capabilities are poor. Maybe they're just not good. Data, information flows, think Abashi technique there. Data and information standards, or tooling. When we come to external drivers, those typically can be around governance or policy related activities. So maybe state policies, public sector environments, Sarbanes-Oxley, government, state legislation, whatever it may be. So the external drivers can come from governance or policy type areas. And then the final type of driver, the generic drivers, called commercial drivers. And commercial drivers, you need to think over the service provider and the service integrator layer there, in terms of whether it's the roadmap considerations or whether it's just tooling and processes and interfaces. Terminology and acronyms. So I'm going to very quickly go through some quick fire acronyms, and also I'm going to cover practices, functions, roles, structural elements, models, and roadmap. So if we start with the first one, hopefully by now Siam, you know, stands for Service Integration and Management. When we talk about methodology, just on this, we are talking in the context of practices, processes, functions, roles, and structural elements. Structural elements. When we talk about MSI, you may hear the term MSI, that's multi-sourcing integration. SMI, Service Management Integration. SI, Service Integration. SM and I, Service Management and Integration. SI and M, Service Integration and Management. SP goes along with SI. SP, Service Provider. So let's dig into service practices. So Siam practice has 4 categories: people, process, measurement, and technology. The functions. So when we talk about each organisation in a Siam ecosystem has its own practices, its own processes, its own structures. And in each of those layers, it's very specific to that particular organisation. So if we think through the SI layer, so the service integration layer, so if we think through the model of, you've got strategy at the top with the customer, you've got integration, which is the service integrator, and then you've got delivery, which is the service provider. The service integrator is around making sure that the various service providers are playing nicely together, they're collaborating, it's an end-to-end view in terms of assurance that they're all nicely integrated, they're all collaborating, they're all coordinated, and that there's an operational governance and management structure there. But you do need to think through each individual layer: the strategy, the integration, the delivery, the customer, service integrator, and service provider. Roles. When we talk about roles, so whether this is Siam governance lead or Siam ops lead or process owners, or roles in governance boards, or perhaps within the customer there are retained capabilities that cover things like governance and oversight or engagement. There's going to be roles there. These are separated out in terms of SI activities, so perhaps there's service provider, orchestration roles, there's integration and collaboration roles there. So roles and responsibility need to be defined within Siam. A RACI matrix is a great way of doing that. In fact, one of the main reasons for Siam not working is this whole point around roles. It's really important you get this right in terms of making sure that they're not only defined but they're implemented. So as you go through the roadmap, you must make sure that it's absolutely clear who is doing what within each layer of the organisation, the function, and the structural element. Talking of structural elements, what's a structural element? So that it refers to entities that have responsibilities, and it spans over the various layers over the entire ecosystem. So there are 3 of those. They're boards, process forums, and working groups. Models. So by now we should be pretty familiar in terms of the Siam model. There's no single 100% absolute spot on prescriptive model for an organisation. Each organisation needs to work out what's going to work for them, what's the scope, what's the outcome that they're looking to achieve, what's the driver behind all of this. So there's no definitive solution. Clearly there are models. We've got an externally sourced, we've got an internally sourced, we've got a hybrid type model, and we've got lead supplier. But each organisation needs to work out what's going to work well the structure would look like you've got a customer organization at the top, you've got the service integrator layer, and then you've got the service providers, which would be internal and external service providers. And within that environment, you're going to have functions, you're going to have practices, you're going to have processes, all glued together that span the structural elements, are boards, process, forums, and working groups. And then as we talk about the roadmap, so there's 4 stages around a roadmap. From a terminology perspective, the high level stages and activities are listed under 4 areas, and those 4 areas, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a few moments, but they're discovery and strategy, plan and build, implement, run and improve. Basically, when you hear the term Siam Roadmap, these are the stages, these are the high level summary stages and the activities that are required for a customer to move to the model, to the Siam model, whatever model they've chosen. And as I say, they're broken into 4 stages. I've got a separate video on this on my channel, so please do have a look at those. So if we go through each stage very briefly, there is 4 iterative stages. It's a framework, it's a planning framework, it determines structures, it guides your implementation, it sets up robust change management. And when I say change, I don't just mean technical, I mean organizational change there as well. We'll touch on that in a minute. It puts a structure in place for making things more efficient, a structure for making things more effective. It's worthy of note, it's not always linear, but there's a rough flow that you will see. And each stage, like in a lot of frameworks, each stage's got an input and each stage's got an output. The discovery and strategy stage, so think due diligence, think capability analysis. So what you're doing here is you're understanding, you're looking at the value, you're mapping, looking at objectives and defining. So questions might be here: what's the customer's strategy? What is their vision? Where are they trying to go? What are they looking to try and achieve? What are their challenges? Who's doing what? Where does that function fit into another function? So I keep talking about racy matrices, but that's a really good example of where you can start to understand who's actually doing what, perhaps in a little more detail here. But the as-is situation, looking outwards, what's available in terms of the service integrator landscape and the service provider landscape? What risks do we need to be thinking about? What are the costs? And understand the marketplace overall. This stage, this discovery and strategy stage, it's starting a project. It's not a let's do this in the background while we're doing everything else. It is a formal project start. It provides that high level of governance. It establishes the as is, the state of the nation, and then using this information, it allows you to start thinking around things like business cases and outline cases. The next step is plan and build. So this is where you get to your detailed Siam model. So which model is going to be best here? Is it going to be internal, external, hybrid, lead supplier? You start to consider organizational change management here, OCM. This is so important. This is how to manage the change within people. This isn't technical change, this is people change. So you start to think around the awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement. There are the ADKAR model. You start to think about appointing service providers or perhaps retiring service providers. You'll start to plan for transition. A real good tip here is just watch out for shadow IT, i.e. people within the business perhaps working off grid to IT. So a service provider that maybe is outside of the IT governance model. The implementation approach. So this fundamentally is about, do you go for a big bang? Do you go for a phased bang? There are pros and cons of each. You need to start thinking about this organizational change management and start to do some of the awareness, the desire, the knowledge, the ability, the reinforcement activities. you are then introducing service providers or perhaps retiring service providers. You're making sure all the risks have been identified and you've got plans in place to mitigate them. And then things like employment regulations will start to come into play here, TUPE regulations with staff transfers. And then the run and improve stage. So this is keeping the lights on, operating the ecosystem. It's the day-to-day operations, the day-to-day integration, the collaboration piece, service improvement, fine-tuning, making sure that you really are demonstrating you've got a fair, collaborative, impartial environment. You're working through those structural elements that we talked about. So the working groups, the governance boards, perhaps change advisory board here, reporting on the performance of value to demonstrate this end-to-end value. Slight plug on another video here. Have a look at some of my balanced scorecards videos that talk about this. You're looking and focusing on those business outcomes. What are the business KPIs? What are the real KPIs? Okay, so that's it really. Just a very quick kind of summary of Siam 101, and please feel free to subscribe and like the video, and I'll continue to post information around Siam. Thank you.